Hello there, everybody. Welcome back to Star Wars Lads. We are going to break down your community bracket from our latest Star Wars Lads Bracket Challenge. We have Eric Eilersen from Youtini here. Thank you for joining us. We are going to look at all the matchups and talk about our picks. So we're happy to have you here, and we thank you for being a part of the show.
Of course. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited, man. I love sports. I love books. It all works. Brackets are the best.
Yeah, the perfect marriage of all of it, honestly. Like, that's what we're going for here. We both are huge sports fans as well, so this is going to be a lot of fun. So we're going to break down all of your brackets. Before we do so, though, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We're trying to get up to like 1,500 subs here pretty soon around Mandalorian, so make sure you're subscribing. It'll really help us out with the YouTube algorithm, all that good stuff. Comment below, let us know what we did wrong on our brackets, and as well as like what your opinions are on the overall community bracket, because you might have voted for something else that did not make it all the way to final. Let us know why your fellow community members got it wrong or got it right. Let us know the positive stuff too. Okay, so let's dive in. And we look at the bracket here. A lot of round one, if we're looking at the 32 entries that we put out, it went pretty according to plan, but there was one very specific one, and we know a lot of you will be watching this, and you are diehard New Jedi Order fans. And New Jedi Order is the only major upset that made it out of round one, and it did make it to round two. We had a lot of great people commenting and telling us, giving us quotes from the books directly. There were a lot of big New Jedi Order fans out there. And specifically, all three of us chose Lost Stars over New Jedi Order. But I wanted to point to you, Eric, because you chose Lost Stars to make it all the way to your semifinals. Why do you think the community went for New Jedi Order over Lost Stars?
Ooh, see, that's a good question. I think for the community, for all y'all there that love New Jedi Order, I love that for you because that is a commitment. It shows you are dedicated as a person. You have a great moral compass because you started a series, you read 19 books, and you're like, I love it. And that takes a lot of fortitude. And I think that New Jedi Order also came out at a point in Star Wars publishing where you were kind of all in or kind of all out at that point. And there were folks that were just kind of carrying the banner of Star Wars at that point with the Yuuzhan Vong War. And I'm sure a lot of you that voted for that were with your friends at that point, like getting each next book, talking about it, lending it out, trying to explain what these like freaky, like biological weapon ship using monsters were in Star Wars. And that's a very huge thing. So I think there's a lot of history involved with that. For me, Lost Stars is the reason that I'm here talking about Star Wars books at all, because that's what got me back into Star Wars books in 2015. And I still, to this day, believe it is either number one or number two as far as books to give someone if they're like, I've never read a Star Wars book, what should I do? And I think that it has great character relationships with Dane and Sienna. I think it perfectly kind of gives you the whole scope of the original trilogy through new lenses, but is also familiar enough that if you haven't read a Star Wars book, you kind of know what's going on. Oh, yeah, the Death Star, I remember that. Ah, Hoth. And I still think, for my money, Claudia Gray is one of the best word-for-word writers that Star Wars has ever seen, and she just writes the scene work and the dialogue and the action so well that it's kind of a one wonderful package. For me personally, my taste always has gone to more of like the character-driven, familiar things rather than New Jedi Order is pretty plot-heavy. There's a lot of great character moments, but it is capital P, plot, mythos, stuff like that. So nothing wrong with that, but for me, that's why Lost Stars is just kind of always going to reign supreme in that way for me, and I was happy to kind of push it through a lot of the matchups, even though the beloved community didn't quite make it go as far as we did.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree because Lost Stars, because of new canon restarting, right? We don't think often about canon books having a legacy, but really Lost Stars does. And it was not only the one that kickstarted Claudia Gray's career in Star Wars, but outside of that, coming out the same day as Aftermath, being that book that nobody was really looking forward to, and the fact that it took all of us by surprise. Like nobody was looking forward to Lost Stars over Aftermath. And then we read it, and it was like, this is so much better than Aftermath. And this is really the seminal piece of Star Wars canon at that point. And it was kind of that first book that really we could all look at it and be like, this is where Star Wars canon can go. And this is how we can move in a new direction and show some new character perspectives that we really haven't seen in Legend. And I completely respect New Jedi Order as well. I'm glad it went so far. You know, it's awesome to have upsets in the bracket. And there are a lot of books that, frankly, sometimes don't work. And there are stories that do drag it down. Sanak, I want to point the next question towards you, because one that has been, especially on our channel, I don't know if it has been for you guys, Eric, but Brotherhood seems to have just had this massive cult following. as
Yeah.
we progressed through it. And for us, we both really loved it. But it is a character-centric book and not really a plot-centric book.
Mhm.
And we put it up against what was probably the biggest plot-centric book last year, which was Shadow of the Sith. And Sanak, you picked Shadow of the Sith over Brotherhood. Why do you think the community has really fallen in love with Brotherhood so much over top of Shadow of the Sith? Because we've done a lot of these polls and Brotherhood always wins.
I think in some ways it's similar to how when we did our first review for Brotherhood, I was extremely ecstatic about it. I was very happy with it turned out because for me personally, one of the biggest issues that I've had with the cutoff of Legends and canon is that some material was always kind of meant to work together still. So you still look at like the 2003 Clone Wars, the micro series, and especially that first volume. It sort of segues into what we see with the Battle Christosis and everything else there. So I really needed to see the emotional growth. I needed to see quite literally the things that needed to happen for them to be so much more militarized than where they are at the end of Attack of the Clones. And I think all that, plus the fact that it's such a popular duo, especially as prequel appreciation has only grown more and more. Once the sequel eras came, right, the prequels fell in love. When we were talking about the people, when we grew up with the prequels, not so much love there, right? So I think there's cycles all kind of combining. 2022 was the year of Obi-Wan Kenobi coming out, the promised reunion of Hayden and Ewan. So I think we were all ready just to devour anything that came our way. All of these elements put together, I was like, yeah, I can see why the fandom loves it.
Yeah, you really hit it there on nail on the head. I think
Yeah.
also visually too, in this era of prequel love, seeing Obi-Wan and Anakin on the cover, I just think frankly a lot more people have read Brotherhood as well. Eric, I want to talk one more thing in the first round for your bracket as well. You picked the Han Solo trilogy going pretty far, upsetting Kenobi and then upsetting even Republic Commando as well. Talk about a little bit why the Han Solo trilogy is so important to you.
Ooh, Han Solo trilogy and Kenobi was evil to put in the first round for me. That felt so wrong. Because I think Kenobi as a book is actually more impactful than the Han Solo trilogy. I'll admit. I think that is like, if you voted for that, yeah, of course, that's great. But for me, the Han Solo trilogy, I think, is one of those trilogies that made me fall in love with Han, the character, even more than the movies. I think AC Crispin, for my money, writes the best Han, full stop. I think that is who the character is. I hear Harrison Ford in the back of my head, mixed in with a little bit of Alden Ehrenreich sometimes, which is really fun. I love this story. I love the young smuggler. There's a lot of unrequited love in it. There's bounty hunter stuff. I mean, once you get to like the Hutt Gambit, Lando's doing some cool stuff. You're at Nar Shaddaa. Like, it's all the stuff everyone wanted in the video games of like Star Wars 1313 and all that kind of stuff. It's like, no, these books are that. It's like, what if the smugglers were in charge? But it's also a very emotionally resonant Han. And I think why those books are so cool to me is that they are sprawling. There's multiple planets, there's multiple adventures, but there's also a time to see how Han gets to the point of quite literally his entrance in A New Hope. Kenobi is a masterpiece, but if I'm just picking up a book just to read for a fun adventure and to know my Star Wars characters, I gotta go with this Crispin trilogy.
I think that's really fair too, because the Han Solo trilogy is kind of an indelible part of his life, especially in the EU timeline. Because Kenobi, while it's titled Kenobi, most of the book is from the perspective of other characters. So there's a part of it that is a little bit more distant, and as a singular narrative, it is really, really nice. But Han Solo trilogy has that impact because every time you watch the movie, you see it different. And every time, and especially looking at canon, the way it's translated onto canon as well, having that legacy post the death of the EU for all intents and purposes, it does survive on. I understand where you're coming from with that as well. Obi-Wan's my favorite character, so I went with with Kenobi. So let's move on to the next round. There's one matchup in particular I also want to talk about. Most of the round of 16 and even the quarterfinals, we'll probably gloss over a lot of that because a lot of it went exactly how it was seeded, and none of us have anything too incredibly different. And we've talked about Lost Stars and Han Solo trilogy as well. But one thing that I personally had, but the community had your guys' back and you guys picked, was the High Republic Phase 1 beat Bloodline, which is one of my favorite books and actually my favorite canon novel. Sanak, can you talk a little bit about why the High Republic Phase 1, which went all the way to your final as well as yours, Eric? So talk a little bit about why the High Republic Phase 1 was so important to you and why you had it upsetting not just Bloodline, but Darth Plagueis and some of these other novels that made it so far in the community bracket.
It's just something so fresh about it, whereas Bloodline is trying to make up for what is missing in the sequels. High Republic is like, this is something that Legends hasn't touched. This isn't something that Canon hasn't touched. This is quite literally just an empty drawing board. So let's just throw our ideas out here. I love the characters. I love what's so fresh and dynamic about having the true Jedi. We all thought when the prequels were coming out, hey, these are going to be the Jedi in their prime, but that was never George's intentions. It was just to show how they were in their twilight right before their fall because of their creed, because of their dogma, stuff like that. So seeing them fully fledged out, be players, interacting with other non-Force beings and having very interesting dynamics, which were just not really there in the prequels and prequel adjacent material, I really appreciated. And the villain, the Nihil, are so good. I mean, Markion Ro, I mean, he is probably the best book novel in my mind since Thrawn. All right. I know people might think that's like a huge leap. So when I see a Markion Ro, I was like, okay, sure. Like, what's going to be happening here? But no, we got to really explore the whole structure of the Nihil. It's not a top-down thing. It's everyone has their voice. They're all kind of fighting each other for that power. The Eye of the Storm, like quite literally the imagery associated with the group is so strong and so different. I also love that they're just like chaotic, like listening to Crash Punk and all this other stuff. And at the same time, when they're interacting with different parts of the galaxy and different Jedi, it doesn't go the same way as I'd expect a prequel Jedi to be like, no, you guys are wrong. It's like, no, we're trying to figure out why you guys did this. Okay, I can kind of understand what you're trying to do here. Okay, that's not cool. There's different opinions and perspectives, even if they're all working together. And that nuance is what makes their inaction kind of sad at times because they're still trying to understand, try to do the right thing. Dynamics that just aren't there in any other period. You can even look at Legends when the humans interact with the Jedi. The Jedi are just so mystic. Here it's like, no, these are characters who just have an ability, have a connection, but are still in many ways trying to let the rest of the galaxy understand and enjoy that in some ways. And I can keep going on about the High Republic. I love so many things about it. And Bloodline, I love what it does more so than just the story. But I have to be in that mindset. But High Republic, I can pick out any book, even those junior novel books. And I'm like, I'm going to have a really fun, rich story that takes me through so many ups and downs, so many different emotions. And even if I don't completely love it, I can appreciate it at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Yeah. Eric, would you like to add on to that? Because you had it in your finals as well.
I did. I mean, 10 out of 10 agree with everything you're saying. I mean, I'm looking around my office right now. I have 4 copies of each adult novel of Phase 1. Every single thing about Phase 1 made me fall in love with Star Wars more than I thought I ever could, which is crazy because we're all obsessed with it. But like, Light of the Jedi, I will still say, despite what happens in my finals, Light of the Jedi is my favorite Star Wars book. Full stop, end of sentence. I think I remember where I was when I finished it for the first time. After that first book, Loden Greatstorm was one of my top 5 favorite Star Wars characters. Markion Ro, I believe, and I said in our coverage of it way back when, I think he has the best villain introductions, I'll say, since Darth Vader. I'll go in before Thrawn. I think his intro in Light of the Jedi is terrifying. And he's an amazing villain throughout the whole thing. You get amazing discussions about the Force and how Jedi view it and how the galaxy feels about it. But you also get a Jedi throwing a lightsaber on the top while flying on top of a dragon. Like, it's just like everything Star Wars can be, I believe, is High Republic Phase 1. There are some stories that don't click for me in it. Sure, there's a couple books that I don't absolutely adore. But I think kind of in a similar way to our talk about NJO earlier, like, this is our NJO, but I think for me, times a bunch more because it's a little more expansive as a universe. It's not just one single set of characters. High Republic for me is kind of the be-all, end-all of Star Wars publishing. And I said earlier, if you're not going to give someone Lost Stars, I earnestly think if you've never read a Star Wars book, give them Light of the Jedi. Also, the Bloodline is amazing. Bloodline is great. And it's apples and oranges, but these apples just happen to be the High Republic. So...
No, I love the Light of the Jedi love because that's my favorite book in the High Republic too. Like that one is so good. I just love building out the world. Like Markion Ro in that book is insane. Bloodline was the one that it just kind of all clicked. I read it before I saw The Last Jedi, and then I thought they did a great job with Leia in The Last Jedi, and I really love the mature Leia.
Love it. Yeah.
And it just clicked. It was one of those things that Leia was always, you know, even looking back at the OT, Leia is that character because she's so strong and because she is so constant. She doesn't go through waves of changes and emotions in the OT. She is the kind of the third string character out of Han, Luke, and Leia. But I feel like this era, especially Disney canon, has given her so much. And for me, it started with Bloodline. It was just a look at her that I had never felt like I really got. And I loved it. And I've always loved it. When
you can hear Carrie in that book too. I think Claudia Gray writes Carrie Fisher specific, like older Carrie Fisher's voice is that book. I think more than any other novelization, whatever it may be, like it's eerie. I remember reading that for the first time, and after having seen Force Awakens, and like, oh my god, like you can hear the pitch of her voice.
So let's talk about one more thing before we get to the final matchup, because Eric, your final was different than both of ours. I had the exact final that the community had with Thrawn and Plagueis. Sanak had High Republic versus Thrawn. You had High Republic, and we talked about your first entry in your final. You also had the Revenge of the Sith novelization, which is absolutely wonderful. And I want to give you time to rant and rave about how great that is.
Oh my god. The Revenge of the Sith novelization is, for my money, the best Star Wars book. My favorite Light of the Jedi. The writing in the Revenge of the Sith novelization is the most confounding thing in the world, because the first time you read that prologue, you're like, am I reading an ancient medieval epic text? Because Matthew Stover treats the pageantry of Revenge of the Sith with all the respect that the saga deserves as a whole. And I think this is the closest we've ever gotten to a historian, because, Lucas was like, originally the screenplay is stolen from the Journal of the Wills, right? Like, it's history. This is a poet crafting Revenge of the Sith and all the epicness that, especially us prequel kids, gave it when we first saw it. Revenge of the Sith was never one of my favorite movies. That's one of my weird things. Even as a prequel kid, I always put it below all the OT. I read this, I watched it again, and I'm like, oh, yes, okay. This is, I think, the Star Wars book that just uses the most poetry of anything else. Hilariously, speaking of Brotherhood earlier, the only knock I give to Brotherhood is when it tries to overly reference Revenge of the Sith too much, because then I'm realizing it's not hitting those heights. Then I'm like, you're trying to copy the style, but now I'd rather just be reading Revenge of the Sith. Because Revenge of the Sith is not like any other Star Wars books, Unfortunately, if you read it and you're like, where's the next one just like that? It does not exist. They did not continue doing this. Even Shatterpoint and Schrader, Stover's other work, are good. They're not the same style. For whatever reason, he chose this book to write very lavishly. There's dialogue in here that's not in the film. There's scenes that aren't in the film, all of which were approved by Lucas. It's the only Star Wars manuscript he ever approved personally. And there's just so much in it that enhances the Skywalker saga. Now, the High Republic probably as a whole means more to me as an idea. I think about the High Republic more than I think about Revenge of the Sith in a bracket. And I'm like, here's the seeds. We're in the finals. We get tip-off. Who's scoring the most buckets? Revenge of the Sith, beat for beat, bar for bar, page for page, is just undeniable. That's my overly lavish review of the overly lavish Revenge of the Sith. It is that good. It is that good.
It really does. It deserves it.
That good, yeah.
It's so hard to pick. Our final four, I mean, we picked the seeds, and the easiest, the hardest four seeds to seed were 1, 2, 3, 4, but we knew those were the four. And like, we knew that those were going to be the four that people voted on, and they're some of the ones that everybody talks about, right? From all over. And I love all four of them so much. Like they're all so 10 out of 10s for me. Yeah. Even I, we've had a lot of comments about Bane, Rule of Two, and Dynasty of Evil not necessarily being as good as Path of Destruction. But for me, I love Rule of Two. Like the violence. The violence that Carpishian writes in that book is unlike anything you'll ever read. That final battle is just insane. When it got to the finals, I ended up going with Thrawn over Revenge of the Sith. Not because I think it's necessarily a better book, not because of really the legacy, but it for me, it's like when I think of Star Wars books, that's the one I remember first hearing about when I was a kid, and then eventually reading, and it lived up to that hype, and then rereading it as an adult, and it living up to what I remember it as a kid. I'm not trying to throw shade or anything. I love the sequels, but it's the best. Like, it's the best sequel you could read to Star Wars, and the sequels take place 30 years after, so they really shouldn't be comparable to the Thrawn trilogy at all. There's no reason they should be compared in the same sentence. They're not the same story. But the Thrawn trilogy completely captures the spirit of the OT and what those characters would be like 5 years down the line. And because of its legacy, because of the Thrawn himself, and you just feel like you're watching a movie when you read it. Like you feel like you're watching the epilogue of the OT. And I've always loved it for that. And I think because of its like newer story, as much as Revenge of the Sith adds, it adding like a whole new piece of mythology and basically kickstarting Star Wars books for all intents and purposes.
Yeah.
I had to go with that over Revenge of the Sith. But Sanak, it was your winner of your bracket. Talk a little bit about why you love the Thrawn trilogy so much.
I mean, it's the godfather of Star Wars books, and in some ways you just cannot deny it. When we talk about legacy, we talk about impact of Star Wars movies, we talk about the original trilogy, we talk about the prequels. Eventually, we'll talk about the sequels and the TV shows. But the books, it all comes straight back to this. I think even the cover is so iconic. This reignited everyone's passion for Star Wars again. Star Wars was not done. It could be done on the screen, but it could still continue forever. This was, in a way, the rebirth of the franchise after, some more of the kiddie-ish tendencies that George Lucas had really started leaning into with 83 with the merchandising, with the Ewoks and whatnot. Here, it's like, no, Star Wars felt serious to us back then, even if it is quite campy and goofy. Here's a villain who really takes that to the next step. Here are some really interesting sci-fi ideas like cloning. But I think now, like the elements of like Mount Tantus and all that, those things I didn't really appreciate as much. I just focused on Luke and some of Thrawn and some of Leia and Han. Now, when I think about it, I'm like, oh no, Talon Karrde, Mara Jade, all those elements were like really strong, really cool. Just how the New Republic was working. I mean, like the introduction of like the E-Wing, right? That's not even something I really thought about. And it's just there. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. And now I'm like, well, this was like the first book that was like, seriously trying to move Star Wars forward in the future instead of just rehashing the same imagery and characters. Obviously, you have to build off of them, but they were new. They were different. They started the same, but once they were done, I was like, oh, wow, these are not the original trilogy trio that I knew when I started these books. Yeah, I'm excited for the future, what the story is, but at the end of the day, I'm always going to go back to the original and appreciate it for what it is.
Totally.
I completely think that's fair, and it didn't end up making my final as well. I think we're going to talk about the finals right now. So, Sonic picked the Thrawn trilogy. We've shown that graphic up here as his winner, so that was one of our two finalists. And, I picked Darth Plagueis as my winner. I'll talk a little bit about Darth Plagueis right now. For me personally, Darth Plagueis was one of the first Star Wars books that I read that was just like, I felt so rewarded for being a Star Wars fan. It was like not just the prequels, not just the original trilogy, but Knights of the Old Republic, Bane trilogy, everything you can possibly think of in Star Wars is touched on and impacted by the Darth Plagueis book. And Palpatine as one of my like favorite villains, as being just this like insanely goofy, but at the same time creepy, campy, like super villain in the prequel trilogy. It's something growing up with Revenge of the Sith being the first Star Wars movie I got to see in theaters. That was like my favorite version of Palpatine. Seeing his origin story, especially, I think struck a chord with me, but also getting to see this person who is mentioned in the best scene, arguably, in the film that you just think is like a legend, but this story brings Plagueis to life, and it makes him both the like co-author of Palpatine's plot, but also you see his hubris as the reason that he isn't the one that ends up being the Sith that makes the culmination of the Rule of Two and destroys the Jedi. It's his hubris that makes him lose. And you see, even if some people want to say this book diminishes a little bit of Palpatine's plot and maybe his role in the story as a whole, but I think you see Palpatine as the opportunist he is throughout the entire series. You see him take advantage of this aging, older, more wrapped up in his mind, seeing his own mortality, Plagueis, but also trying to prevent it. Palpatine pulls the strings there on his own master and manipulates him, and ultimately puts him into a point where he just is trapped and can't get out. I also just love watching The Phantom Menace with the idea that Plagueis is still hovering around. Like, it's so good. I love it so much. James Luceno's writing, I think, is great, but also it can come off like a textbook at times for sure. But like, It references everything that I love, all the dark side stuff, all of the Force stuff. That's my bread and butter of Star Wars, and it references everything I love. So that's why I personally went with it for my favorite Star Wars book of all time. Eric, I'm going to pass it over to you because you didn't have either of these books in your final.
No.
Which one would you have chosen if this was the final matchup and you were voting in the poll with the community?
Out of Plagueis and the Tron trilogy, I will say, surprisingly to myself, it's nothing personal. I'd probably say Plagueis. I like how you described it as kind of the culmination of everything, and it is kind of like a chore. It's kind of like the Elden Ring of Star Wars, where like, listen, it is grueling, it is punishing at times. You're gonna finish chapters and be like, why am I doing this? This makes no sense, and you'll end it, and you're like, is that the best thing I've ever read? Like, it has that moment of really sneaking up on you. And I think that the moments when Plagueis is really at its best are in those mythology building moments. Like Luceno is a very fascinating author. Catalyst, another one in the bracket that didn't go super far, but I think I really like, is another one of those books that has some chapters that are just about rocks and minerals composition. But by the end of it, you realize why those were in there, because they're important. And I think Plagueis has that thing where you could just have a 250-page book that's like, here is the bad guy and his apprentice, and he trains, and then he gets him while he's asleep, and that's over. And it's like, no. We got to know what the Neimoidians are doing. We got to know why the trade routes will eventually matter. We got to know why Sith sorcery is a big deal, and how he's actually using the economy and the bank to funnel. Like, there's just so many levels of it, and I think it's a true epic in that sense. The Thrawn trilogy is great. Everything, Sanak, you said about it kind of reinvigorating the entirety of the Star Wars brand is true. The fact that there's basically just a bunch of more movies of Star Wars is also absolutely true. And I think it's really great in that way. For me, for no really tangible reason, when I read it, I didn't fall as in love with it. And for whatever reason, Plagueis is kind of, again, its own thing, where it could still be canon, a lot of it. It hasn't really been overwritten, which is fun. But just the characterizations of the genius level planning that Palpatine and Plagueis are both doing at various points, I think, are just kind of unbelievable by the end. Am I ever going to read it again? No. And that's fine. We all got more stuff to read, but I don't necessarily think that rereading is the hallmark of a great book. Sometimes you can read a book once, and that's all it has to be. Plagueis was that for me.
Exactly. Well, that was a great discussion, guys. Thank you both for being here. We're going to wrap it up right now. Make sure you've commented and let us know your thoughts now that you hear everything that we've had to say. Eric Eilersen from Youtini, make sure you check out his stuff. Eric, would you like to plug your show on the Youtini channel?
Oh, sure. So we're over at the Youtini YouTube channel. Every Monday night, we do the Living Force podcast live, which is book focused, but we talk about a little bit of everything here and there. We do roundtables for every new release, where we talk about the books in depth. Or you can go to our podcast catchers, Living Force Podcast. We do author interviews as often as we can, talk about all the books, and then, of course, go to youtini.com, where we put in all our reviews. We have book guides. We have a massive team of over 40 people that's constantly making updates to the book timelines, to the release schedule, everything you could want. So Youtini on all the platforms, and then Living Force Podcast on Monday nights.
Yeah. Best website for books, honestly, Star Wars books on the internet, like by far. It's so helpful. It's insane. Like I look at your guys' scores a lot for anything I'm interested in reading, Legends wise, that I haven't read. So absolutely agree that you definitely need to check out their website. If you somehow haven't heard of it and you're watching this video, definitely check it out. But make sure you're liking this video, subscribe, comment. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you guys all next time.